Feel the drums, hear the sound, ancient wisdom spinning round. From every tribe, from every shore, ditty, story, fire, hear them roar.
Sunville was the kind of town that never truly slept. The air smelled of fried plantain and roasted corn. The streets were alive with noise, women selling goods, taxi drivers honking, hawkers running after moving cars, waving groundnuts and cold drinks. Somewhere in the middle of all that noise and life, Miriam lived. She was the kind of woman who always smiled, even when she was hurting. People called her the Sunshine Girl, because she had a way of making even the darkest days seem brighter. At 24, Miriam had big dreams: to own her own beauty salon, to travel the world, to live a life full of love and happiness. And for a long time, she thought George was the man who would give her that love. George was the kind of man who could charm anyone. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a deep voice and a smile that made women weak. He carried himself with confidence, the kind that made people listen when he spoke. Miriam met him on a rainy afternoon 3 years ago. She had been struggling to cross the flooded road, her slippers almost slipping off her feet. A car sped past, splashing dirty water all over her yellow dress. She gasped, stepping back, her hands shaking. Then he was there.
Are you okay?
She looked up into the most handsome face she had ever seen. George smiled, pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around her wet shoulders. Miriam laughed, embarrassed. You don't have to do that. What kind of man would I be if I let a beautiful woman stay cold? She blushed. That was how it started. A simple act of kindness turned into long calls, stolen kisses, and endless laughter. For 2 years, George was the perfect boyfriend. He sent her flowers at work. He called her my queen. He remembered the little things, how she liked her tea, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the song she always hummed when she was happy. He was everything she had prayed for. But love has a way of hiding the truth. Miriam didn't see the red flags. Not at first. The first time it happened, she laughed it off. She had been having lunch with her best friend Tessa when George called. She picked up with a smile. Hey, baby, where are you? His voice was tight. At a restaurant with Tessa. Silence. Then his voice dropped lower. Is it just the two of you? Miriam frowned. Yes, why? I saw a guy in the background. She laughed. George, it's a restaurant. There are men everywhere. I don't like the way he was looking at you. That was the first time she felt it. That strange, creeping fear. She pushed it aside. He was just being protective, right? But then it happened again and again. If she didn't pick up his calls immediately, he would get angry. If she talked to a male colleague, he would ask too many questions. If she wanted to go out with friends, he would ask, "Why do you need to go out when you have me?" Miriam ignored it. She told herself, this is what love looks like. He just cares too much. Until the night he broke her phone. Miriam had been texting a male colleague about work. George walked in and saw her laughing at her phone. Who are you chatting with? She turned, surprised. Oh, just Amika from work. His face darkened. Let me see the message. Miriam frowned. George, that's ridiculous. Give me the phone, Miriam. She refused. Before she could react, he grabbed her wrist, hard. Who the hell do you think you are? His voice was low, dangerous. Miriam gasped. She had never seen him like this before. He snatched the phone from her hand and threw it against the wall. The screen shattered. So did something inside her. For the first time, Miriam felt afraid of the man she loved. You don't respect me, he whispered, his chest rising and falling. You think you can play me? Tears welled up in her eyes. George, what's wrong with you? Then as fast as it came, his anger disappeared. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Baby, I'm sorry. I just love you too much. Miriam stared at him, her heart racing. Was this love? She wanted to leave, but he grabbed her hand gently this time. Stay. Don't leave me, my queen. I can't live without you." Her heart softened, and she stayed. The next day, George apologized with gifts. Perfume, a new phone, flowers, everything was perfect again. Until Valentine's Day. That night, he took her to a fancy restaurant. The lights were dim. The air smelled of roses and red wine. Couples laughed around them. George held her hand. His eyes were shining. Then he pulled out a small black box. Miriam's stomach dropped. "Marry me, my love," he said softly. Her mouth went dry. She should have felt happy. But all she felt was fear. This wasn't right. She wasn't ready. Not for a man who got angry so easily. Not for a man who tracked her every move. Not for a man who once said, "If I can't have you, no one will." Miriam took a deep breath. "George, I love you, but I need time." Silence. Then his face changed. The warmth disappeared. His eyes turned cold. "You need time?" Miriam nodded, her hands shaking. George let out a low laugh. "That's okay, my love. Take all the time you need." But his voice told her she didn't have much time left. George came looking ready to fight. His eyes were wild, his chest rising and falling like a man who had made up his mind. Before Miriam could speak, his fist crashed into her face. She fell to the ground, gasping. "You think you can leave me?" He kicked her, sending pain through her ribs. Miriam screamed. Then he poured the petrol on her. The smell filled the room. George's voice was loud, full of madness. "If I can't have you, no one will." The lighter flicked. The fire roared, and Miriam's world turned to flames. The fire came alive like a hungry beast, roaring, swallowing everything in its path. The flames spread fast, licking up the walls, devouring the curtains, creeping toward the wooden chairs and table. Miriam couldn't breathe. She was burning. The pain was unbearable, a sharp, searing agony that ripped through her skin. She screamed, rolling on the ground, trying to put out the fire consuming her clothes. She could hear George laughing, a deep, ugly laugh. "I told you, Miriam," he shouted over the crackling flames. "If I can't have you, no one will." Her vision blurred from the smoke and the pain. She thought she was going to die right there, on the floor of the apartment she had decorated with love. Then a loud bang. Her neighbors. They had heard the screams. Someone kicked down the door, and the night air rushed in. The last thing Miriam saw before she lost consciousness was George's face, twisted with anger, with something close to regret, before he turned and ran into the darkness. Then everything went black. When Miriam woke up, she felt like she was floating in fire. She tried to move, but the pain was everywhere, on her face, her arms, her legs. She gasped, her throat burning like she had swallowed flames. "Miriam, don't move!" A soft hand grabbed hers, holding her down. She turned her head slowly and saw Tessa sitting by her hospital bed. Tessa's face was streaked with tears, her eyes swollen from crying. "Oh, thank God, Miriam, you're alive!" Miriam tried to speak, but her lips were cracked and dry. Tessa pressed a cool glass of water to her lips. "Slowly, okay?" The water felt like heaven, but it did nothing to wash away the horror of what had happened. Her mind was still stuck in that room, in the fire, in George's twisted smile. Her body ached, wrapped in thick white bandages. What happened? Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. Tessa's eyes filled with rage. "George happened. That bastard tried to kill you." Miriam squeezed her eyes shut, the memories crashing down on her. The proposal, the rejection, the madness in George's eyes, the fire. Tears slid down her cheeks. "Where is he?" Tessa clenched her jaw. "Gone. The police are looking for him, but he disappeared." Miriam's heart dropped. George was out there, and she knew one thing for sure. He wasn't finished with her. Miriam spent weeks in the hospital, healing, recovering. Her burns were severe. Third-degree burns covered parts of her back, her arms, and a small section of her face. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive, but Miriam didn't feel lucky. She felt angry, She had loved George, given him her trust, her heart. And he had tried to kill her. At night she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames. She heard George's voice laughing, whispering, "You belong to me." The police came several times asking questions. Did George ever threaten you before this? Did you notice anything strange before the attack? Do you have any idea where he could have gone? Miriam answered as best as she could, but the truth was haunting. She had ignored the warning signs. She had thought George's jealousy was love. She had thought his anger was passion. She had thought his obsession meant he cared. And now she was scarred for life. One night, weeks later, Miriam was discharged from the hospital. Tessa helped her settle into a new apartment, far away from where the attack happened. She didn't want to return to the place where she had almost died. But just when she thought she was safe, the first message came. It was late, past midnight. Miriam was sitting on her bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror, touching the scars on her arm. Then her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Her heart pounded as she opened it. George, did you really think you could escape me, my love? Miriam's blood froze. Her hands shook as she dropped the phone. No. George was still out there, and he wasn't done with her. The next morning, Miriam went straight to the police station. She showed them the message, her hands still shaking. He's still watching me. He's still out there. The officer, a middle-aged man with a hard face, frowned as he read the text. We've been trying to track him, but he's good at hiding. Miriam's heart sank. So what am I supposed to do? Just wait for him to kill me? The officer sighed. We'll put surveillance on your building, but Miriam, you need to be careful. This man is dangerous. She already knew that. She felt it in her bones. George wasn't hiding. He was waiting for the perfect moment. And next time, he wouldn't fail. That night, Miriam sat in bed, her heart pounding. Tessa had insisted on staying over. But even with her best friend beside her, Miriam couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then her phone rang. It was a private number. Her chest tightened. Slowly she picked up. She didn't speak. For a moment there was silence. Then, I miss you, my love. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. George. His voice was calm, too calm. Did you think you could run from me? Miriam gripped the phone tightly, her entire body shaking. George, the police are looking for you. A low chuckle came from the other end of the line. The police can't protect you forever, Miriam. Miriam's stomach twisted. What do you want? His voice dropped to a whisper. I want you back, and if I can't have you... Miriam's blood ran cold. No one will. The line went dead. Miriam sat there, phone in her hand, heart hammering in her chest. He was coming back. She had survived the fire. But now, she had to survive George. Miriam sat frozen, her phone still clutched in her trembling hands. The words echoed in her mind like a cruel whisper in the dark. If I can't have you, no one will. Her heart pounded in her chest. It felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Tessa stirred beside her on the bed, half asleep. Miriam, she murmured, rubbing her eyes. Miriam's lips parted, but no words came out. She felt like, if she spoke, it would make everything real. The call, the threat, the fact that George was still out there, watching, waiting. Tessa frowned, noticing the way Miriam's face had lost all color. What happened? Who called? Miriam's fingers curled around the phone, as if she could squeeze the fear out of her body. She turned slowly to look at Tessa, her throat tightening. It was him. The words barely escaped her lips. Tessa sat up immediately, all traces of sleep gone. No, she whispered. Tell me you're joking. Miriam shook her head, her breathing shallow. Tessa grabbed the phone from Miriam's hand and checked the call history. Private number, she muttered. Her face darkened with anger. That coward, he's hiding, but he has the guts to call you? Miriam shuddered. Tessa, he said he's coming back. The next morning, the sun rose over Sunville like it did every day. bathing the town in golden warmth. But inside Miriam's apartment, it felt like winter had settled in. Tessa paced the living room, phone in hand. She had been on call after call, talking to the police, begging them to do something. Miriam sat curled up on the couch, arms wrapped around herself. She couldn't eat. She couldn't think. Every shadow felt too dark. Every sound felt too loud. She kept picturing George's face, his voice, the flames. She closed her eyes, but all she saw was fire swallowing her whole. Tessa hung up the call and turned to face her. The police say they'll increase patrols around your apartment, but Miriam, she sat beside her, taking her hands gently. Maybe you should leave town. Miriam's stomach twisted. Leave? Her life was here. Her dream of opening a salon. Her job. Her friends. Her memories. Why should she be the one to run? I won't let him take everything from me, Tessa, she said quietly. Tessa's eyes filled with concern. Then we fight back. Miriam looked at her friend, something cold and determined settling in her chest. Yes, no more running, no more being afraid. If George wanted a war, she would give him one. That night the air was thick with heat. Miriam lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Tessa had fallen asleep in the bedroom, but Miriam couldn't close her eyes. She checked the locks for the 5th time. She glanced at her phone, heart hammering. No messages, no calls. Maybe George was gone. Maybe he had given up. She let out a shaky breath. Then, a loud bang outside. Miriam jumped. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she ran to the window. She peeked through the curtain. Her breath hitched. There, painted in blood-red letters on her door, were 5 chilling words. I'm closer than you think. Miriam staggered back, her hands flying to her mouth. No. No, no, no. She spun around, grabbed Tessa's arm and shook her awake. Tessa groaned, rubbing her eyes. Miriam, what? Miriam pointed to the door, unable to speak. Tessa's gaze followed her shaking finger. And then she screamed. The police arrived within minutes, sirens flashing. An officer examined the message on the door, his face grim. Miriam and Tessa stood near the kitchen, arms wrapped around themselves. He was here, Tessa whispered. Miriam felt violated. George had been outside their home, close enough to touch the walls, close enough to leave a message. The officer turned to them. Who else knew where you lived? Miriam's breath caught. Who else? Her mind raced through familiar faces. Then suddenly, a memory hit her like a truck. Bolu, George's best friend. A week before the fire, she had seen Bolu near her street talking on the phone. She had asked him why he was there, and he had laughed it off. Just in the neighborhood, he had said. Had he been watching her? Had he helped George? Miriam turned to the officer, her voice steady. I think I know who's helping him. Miriam and Tessa sat in the back of a police car, watching as the officers approached Bolu's house. Miriam's hands were ice cold. If Bolu had been helping George, that meant George was closer than they thought. The officers knocked. A few seconds later, Bolu opened the door. Miriam's stomach twisted. He looked nervous. His eyes darted around like a man with a guilty conscience. What's this about? He asked. The lead officer stepped forward. We need to talk about George. Bolu's jaw tightened. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he did something that made Miriam's blood run cold. He glanced over his shoulder just for a second, like someone was inside, like someone was watching. Miriam knew. George was there, hiding, waiting. Before she could react, Bolu slammed the door shut. The officers pounded on the door, shouting. Miriam grabbed Tessa's hand. He's inside. She knew it. She could feel it. And suddenly she realized this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Miriam is done running. But George is still out there. And now she's walking straight into the lion's den. Miriam's hands clenched into fists as she watched the officers pound on the door. Bolu was hiding something. No, he was hiding George. She could feel it in her bones. Her breath came sharp and shallow as adrenaline pumped through her veins. George had tried to kill her, left her scarred and broken, and now he was hiding behind his friend's door, waiting for another chance to finish what he started. Tessa grabbed her arm. "Miriam, let's go. Let the police handle this." But Miriam didn't move. She had spent too long being afraid. She had spent too many nights waking up in cold sweats, dreaming of flames licking her skin, of George whispering her name in the dark. She was done hiding. The officers kept banging on the door, their voices sharp. "Open up, Bolu, or we break it down." Then the sound of something crashing inside. A chair tipping over, a window breaking. "He's trying to run." Miriam acted before she could think. She ran toward the house, pushing past one of the officers. "Miriam, wait!" Tessa shouted. But she was already at the side of the house, just in time to see a shadow dart through the backyard gate. "George!" For a split second their eyes locked. His face was thinner, his beard unkempt, his once perfect clothes now dirty and wrinkled. But the look in his eyes, that same possessiveness, that dangerous hunger. "Miriam, my love," he whispered, "I knew you'd come back to me." Her stomach turned. Even now, even after everything, he still thought he owned her. Not today, not anymore. George took off, running through the backyard into the alley. Miriam hesitated only for a second, then she ran after him. She heard the officers shouting behind her, heard Tessa screaming her name, but she kept going. Her body screamed in protest, her healing burns ached, her lungs burned from the effort. But she didn't stop. Not this time. George turned a corner, sprinting toward the old railway tracks. He was fast, but fear makes you faster, and Miriam was done being afraid. She picked up a piece of wood from the ground as she ran, gripping it tight. He wasn't getting away. George reached the railway bridge, old rusted high above the river. He paused, glancing back, panting. Miriam slowed her steps. This was it. This was the end. She tightened her grip on the wood. "Why, George?" she asked, breathless. "Why couldn't you just let me go?" His eyes darkened. "Because you belong to me, Miriam." His voice was so sure, so final. "I gave you everything, and you repaid me with betrayal." Miriam felt tears burn her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "That wasn't love, George, it was control, and I won't live in fear anymore." His hands curled into fists. "You think you've won?" he spat. He took a step toward her, and Miriam swung the wood with everything inside her. The impact sent George stumbling back. His foot slipped on the wet steel of the railway tracks. His arms flailed, eyes widening in shock. And then he was falling. His scream echoed through the air as he tumbled down the steep slope of the bridge, crashing into the river below. Miriam ran to the edge, her heart pounding. The dark water swallowed him whole. No movement, no bubbles. No, George, he was gone. The officers arrived, guns drawn, shouting, but it was too late. George had fallen into the abyss he created. The next few days passed in a blur. The police dragged the river, but never found George's body. Some said he drowned. Some said he escaped. But Miriam, she didn't care anymore. She wasn't afraid. For the first time in a long time, she felt free. She walked through Sunville's streets, breathing in the air, feeling the sun warm her skin. She smiled again, a real smile. Not because she was the same woman she used to be, but because she had survived. She had loved and lost. She had been broken and rebuilt. She had faced the devil and walked away stronger. And now, she was done with the past. She was moving forward. Weeks later, Miriam sat on her new couch sipping tea. Her scars were healing. Her heart was healing. Tessa walked in, grinning. "There she is, the strongest woman I know." Miriam laughed, shaking her head. She was about to respond when her phone buzzed. A message. Her breath caught. "Unknown number." "Did you really think I was gone, my love?" The mug slipped from Miriam's fingers, shattering on the floor. Her heart stopped. She stared at the message, her hands trembling. Tessa frowned. Miriam, what's wrong? Miriam slowly turned the phone toward her. Tessa read the message. Her face went pale. A heavy silence filled the room. George was still out there, watching, waiting. Miriam had ignored the red flags, thinking love meant possessiveness. She had believed that love should be all-consuming. She had told herself that jealousy was just a sign of affection. But love shouldn't hurt. It shouldn't burn. And when someone shows you who they really are, don't wait for them to set you on fire before you believe them. So now I ask you, have you ever ignored the warning signs of a toxic relationship? Have you ever mistaken obsession for love? And most importantly, if you were Miriam, what would you have done? Let's talk in the comments. Your story might save someone's life. If this story gripped you, don't forget to